Thank you for your patience. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming. This is a great turnout. Very excited to have you all here, and I hope that with the obstructed view you can find a way to see the screen up here. We're very thrilled to have Professor Budge here with us today and to hear more about the work that she's been doing. Professor Budge was first a faculty member at the University of Louisville and is now faculty at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. She has been working in this area for the past 10 years and has quickly become one of the leading experts in the nation on trans populations, the mental health needs of the population, the vocational issues, wellness issues, resilience. We're thrilled to have her here today. She's going to be telling us a little bit about the work that she's done, and I'm going to turn it over to you. So please join me in welcoming her.
That she was my advisor when I was a doc student, so she was a huge influence in a lot of the work that I do, and especially a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm going to be talking about positivity and resilience with trans populations, but before I get started, I'm really curious. I know a lot of you are here because you're here for a class or you were invited to be here. What do you want to get out of this presentation today? All right. Seriously, yeah.
I just want to learn a little more about resiliency.
Okay. Resilience. What else?
Is there something in particular about trans populations and vocational areas that makes a distinction?
Okay. And any other things that you're hoping to get out of the presentation? Okay, so with a raise of hands, how many of you feel like fairly confident in your knowledge related to trans populations? Okay, so we've got a couple people who are maybe kind of halfway raising their hands. Well, so part of what this first part of the presentation is going to be about is we'll talk a little bit about my process of coming to talking about positivity and resilience, but I'm not going to be doing a Trans 101 presentation today. I'm not going to be giving you an hour-long talk about definitions and terms and a lot of things like that. So if there's anything I say today, you don't know what the term is that I'm throwing around, please raise your hand and ask, because that means probably a bunch of other people in the room don't know what that term means either. Before I even get into the content part, I have trans with an asterisk on here. And so part of this is that trans and transgender are considered these umbrella terms for individuals who, what we usually say is someone is assigned a sex when they're born. Usually a baby's born, and if they have a penis or a vulva when they come out, then we say, oh, that's a boy or a girl, right? That's typically how we assign sex when someone's born. And people who identify as trans, transgender, and a couple of other terms that we're going to be talking about today, their identity, their current identity, is not congruent with their assigned sex at birth. So that's some of the language that I'll be throwing around today. Some of the other language that you'll be hearing is the term cis. So I identify as cis, which means that I was assigned female at birth, identify as female now, that's congruent for me, so I'm cisgender or cis. Okay? All right. So if there are any other terms that I throw around, just raise your hand. So there's some evolution of the research questions, and part of this, I started doing research with trans populations my first year as a doctoral student. And when I first started doing research, I was really interested in LGB, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer populations, identify as queer myself, and so for me, I was really curious specifically about queer and bisexual identity development, and that was where I had initially started. But I was actually taking this career counseling class my first year of the doc program, and I was giving a presentation, and they said, well, interview someone from a population who we aren't talking about in the text, and ask them about their work experiences. And so I contacted our local LGBT center in Madison, and I said, I'd love to talk to a trans person about their experiences with work. Can you get me in touch? So they got me in touch with this trans man who had transitioned while at work. He had been doing computer software engineering kinds of things, and he'd mostly been on the phone helping people fix stuff that was going wrong with their computers, right? And he had told me while I was asking him in this interview, what do you think is important for career development? Tell me a little bit about trans identity and work. And he said, when people perceived me as female, right, which is how he had identified most of his life, and how he was socialized, that people didn't give him respect over the phone, right? So he would be telling people how to fix their computers, and since his voice was high, people would question him, they'd ask him to talk to a supervisor. That happened all the time. When he started transitioning and taking testosterone and his voice changed, that never happened. So to me, this was, pretty eye-opening when I was thinking about, this is amazing that something as what I consider as simple as a voice change on a phone can create such a different experience for how you're treated, how you're perceived, what people think about your competence, what people are thinking about you. And so, I started thinking about what does this mean in terms of work, but primarily just mental health in general. How does this impact people's stress levels? And since I identify as cis, I've never had these personal experiences. So I have this privilege of never having gone through any of these experiences. So when I say naivete, it means that when I first started doing research, I used the wrong term sometimes. I didn't really quite know a lot about what was going on because I wasn't a member of the community. And so what I started doing was, I want to interview a whole bunch of people about their identity and their experiences, including work, but also just a general kind of experience about how emotions work. So in Madison and Milwaukee, along with a research team, we interviewed a whole bunch of people and we asked them, what have been your best times emotionally, what have been your worst times, and then we analyzed the data. And then I was really interested in, so we got some really interesting data about what people thought about their best and worst times. I'm not going to go into it too much today. But basically then I thought, so we have these 18 people in Wisconsin who are talking about their best and worst times, which there's a lot of diversity in best and worst times. But then how does that work across the nation? And what we're finding actually is that even though as a nation we see that there are lots of really difficult things that trans people experience, there are a lot of really good things that people experience as well. So that's what I'm going to be talking a little bit about today. So there was something missing, right? So most of what has been focused on in, if you read headlines, right? So trans pageant winner murdered in South Africa. Slaying of trans boy haunts city. Then we had too early to tell trans woman murder was a hate crime, and 3 charged in this possible trans hate crime. Colorado schools are banning this trans first grader from using the restroom. Even though coming out as gay is becoming moot, trans is the most difficult. And then trans kids get help navigating a difficult path, right? So what I want to show is that in popular culture, if you're reading anything in the news or on the media, 2020 does these things all the time on trans kids and talking about what it's like to transition. But most of the time it's, oh, your life is going to be so hard. And I hear that as a clinician all the time, from parents and family members, and even from trans people themselves. All I hear about is how my life is going to be so hard, and I don't know how I'm going to navigate such a difficult life, right? And why would you think any differently? This is what popular culture is telling you about what your life is going to be like, and to validate this, there are a lot of difficulties in how you're being treated. So, I was really interested in, given that this is how popular culture is painting the trans experience, and also a lot of trans people themselves experience a lot of distress because of experiencing minority stress and discrimination. I'm really curious. So, we say that, maybe there's some type of pathology related to being trans. If any of you read the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the current version says if you have gender dysphoria, which is kind of what it used to be gender identity disorder, it's changed a little bit, there are all of these things that are centered around having this diagnosis, this mental health disorder. Yes, it's still considered a mental health disorder even though they changed the name. But the fact is that your identity in and of itself, your identity is a pathology, right? So how do we consider what that means if your identity is pathologized, but also if your identity creates anxiety and depression? It's just pathology upon pathology, right? So most of the studies that I know of really look into stress, anxiety, distress, a lot of that, which is really important because we need to figure out what's going on for some of the negative mental health stuff. But then there was a movement in the last 5 or 6 years called the It Gets Better Project. Who can explain what the It Gets Better Project is? Yeah.
I think it was a project started by Dan Savage,
Mhm.
who writes for The Stranger,
Mhm.
and it's about telling kids of marginalized like sexual identities that they shouldn't commit suicide because later on in their life things are going to get better.
Yep.
I think more or less.
Absolutely, and most of these are videos, right? So it was a lot of LGBTQ people videotaping themselves and saying, this is specifically mostly for adolescents who are coming out, but saying, I know it's so hard right now. You know, this is you're having a really difficult time right now, and maybe you're contemplating suicide or some self-harm or some other things, but it does get better. So that's what the campaign was trying to get this message out that don't give up hope, because things actually really do get better. However, while I think that there was a lot of good intent with this campaign, it doesn't quite fit a lot of what we do in the mental health field, right? If you just tell a client when they come in, oh, don't worry, it's gonna get better, that might provide some hope for a person, but I hear some people laughing, right? You talk to any person who's marginalized or experiences discrimination, you just say, oh, don't worry, it's gonna get better. That's not enough. It's just not. And so while it kind of has this piece of the coin, it's not quite exactly what we're looking for when we're looking for promoting resilience and thinking about what that means for interventions. So one of the things that I was really interested in is that from these studies that we did in Madison and Milwaukee, there were some things that people were describing that we had mostly focused on negativity and pathology, but people were describing positive experiences. They were saying, to be honest with you, the best thing that's happened to me has been transitioning. So, if that's what people are saying is, this is the best thing that's happened, then how do we actually unpack that? Why is it the best thing that you've done? How is that possible, and how can we create interventions when it comes to that piece? Also, things like privilege, how do different types of advantages that you particularly have, either you used to have or you currently have, factor into thinking about resilience? And then this last piece, which is mainly what I'm going to be talking about for the last part of today, is how do we create better vocational outcomes for trans individuals? Because when we think about negativity and a lot of discrimination, a lot of that, especially in the media, is focused on employment. So we have the Employee Non-Discrimination Act, and there's been a lot of focus on that in the media right now, and trans people, a lot of them are just left out of what we call ENDA. They're just, employers say it's too hard to accommodate trans people. We don't want to deal with the bathroom situation. We don't want to deal with accommodating whatever you might need, and so we're just going to ignore it, or you should go somewhere else, right? So how do we create better vocational outcomes for trans people? Okay, so these were some of the questions that I had and how I was thinking about, how do we actually start to think about outcomes, and how do we start to think about interventions and actually helping promote some of this positivity and resilience for trans people? So, like I said, most of the research so far, I only listed a couple of things on here. They focus on negative experiences, they focus on struggles and discrimination, which are real and do exist, so I'll say that. But most of the literature focuses on that. And then also, a lot of the literature focuses mostly on when people are very first coming out. And if we're looking at identity development for trans people, you can come out at any age. You'll notice that the population I'm talking about, we have an age range of 19 to 62, right? And some of them were just coming out. And so I think part of this is that it doesn't, right now, at this current moment in 2014, there really is nothing related to when you're coming out or why or how that is. That might change in the future. But most of the literature focuses on people who are just coming out. What about a trans person who's been out for 25 years? They're looking for a career change, and the company does a background check and they can't find a lot of their information from 25 years ago, right? So part of this is thinking about what happens when it's not just when people are coming out, but how we actually can create positive outcomes for people across their lifespan. Okay, so we're going to roll back a little bit, and instead of talking about work for a minute, we're going to talk about emotions, because when I think of resilience and when I think of positivity, a lot of the things that I think are missing in what we're talking about in the literature is how people actually process their identity experiences or process discrimination or process exactly what's going on for them and make meaning in their lives. So one of the theories that I absolutely love and that I think really applies with a lot of marginalized populations is this broaden and build theory. So basically that these positive emotions, you can list all of them off, they broaden our awareness and they encourage these more exploratory thoughts and creative ways of thinking about things. And if you're thinking about how can you actually help clients in therapy, a lot of times the things that actually help people to come up with more novel options is by exploring some positive emotions, right? So negative emotions tend to prompt these more, like we call them kind of tunnel vision or very focused and very specific behaviors. And then a lot of the research says that people who experience positive emotions tend to be more inventive or be able to have more of a focus on lots of different options that are available to them. And last, there are these longitudinal studies that indicate that it's not just that in these moments you can be more creative, but if you can actually broaden your emotional vocabulary or your experiences over the long term, you'll be able to have more of this inventiveness and more ways of being able to create change within yourself, right? So that's what a lot of the broaden and build theory says. So based on this, I thought, well, why don't we ask trans people about their positive emotions? Why don't we ask them about what that means for them and how they experience them? So this is when I was living in Kentucky, and I'll say that if you've looked at any of the LGBTQ literature, it's either all in New York or San Francisco, right? So if you read these studies, there are all these samples from cities that have really large LGBT populations, lots of resources. In Kentucky, there's not an LGBT center in the whole state. There are some at the universities, but there is not an actual LGBT center for the community in the whole state, right? So I'm living in this state where there are not very many resources and the population is super visible, but that it's a very different way of experiencing community. So I thought, well, we're in Kentucky, why don't we just kind of see where we can drive to? Because we wanted to do in-person interviews. So we're gonna go to Illinois, we're gonna go to Indiana, we're gonna be in Kentucky and Ohio. So we did interviews in all 4 of those states with 43 trans individuals. And these interviews were about 2 hours long. And we asked a lot of different questions about positivity and resilience. And today, I'm only gonna be talking about emotions and then work. So we had 15 trans women, so these were people who were assigned male sex at birth and now identify as female. There were 13 genderqueer individuals. These are individuals who don't feel like they identify as male or female, or they identify as both male and female, or they completely reject gender completely. So genderqueer is kind of an umbrella term for people who don't identify as male or female. There were 11 trans men, so people who were assigned female at birth and now identify as men. And then there were 4 individuals in the study who had multiple trans identities. So there were some people who said, well, I'm a trans, masculine, genderqueer, gender fluid, gender weird person, right? So had lots of different terms for themselves. So there were 4 people who had multiple trans identities. The age range was 19 to 62, right? So the mean was about 36. And the standard deviation was pretty large, so we had a wide range of folks who participated. And then for the race and ethnicity, there were 33 people who identified as white, and then a wide range of other races and ethnicities within the sample. So Native American white, Latina, Korean, Israeli, Jewish and Russian, and mixed. And so we had a wide range of different identities that people were presenting, along with a bunch of others that I'm not representing here within the presentation. So in terms of emotions, what we thought about is we said, well, a lot of the time when we look at emotions, emotions are sometimes feminized and masculinized. So let's look at a sample of trans women and analyze that separately. Let's look at the sample of trans men and we'll analyze that separately, and we'll see what happens. And what actually happened with 2 separate teams coding is that we pretty much found the same thing for trans men and trans women, right? So and I'll talk a little bit about some of the itty-bitty differences that we may have found qualitatively, but so for the trans men and women, you'll see the pretty much the same in terms of there was confidence and how people felt with their positive emotions, comfort, We had amazement and pride and happiness, and then these interpersonal emotions, mostly, when someone says this to me, this is how I felt. So it was basically an emotional reaction to how someone was treating them. And then for the trans men, there were a couple of, like feeling alive and connection were two that were talked about a little bit differently, and I can mention a little bit more about that. So for confidence, yeah.
I'm sorry, what was your question?
Um,
What was the question you asked them?
We just basically asked, and I'm not going into a lot of the methodology just because I thought I would get into mostly a lot of what people are talking about, but we said, what kinds of positive emotions do you experience? Right, so very broad. There were 12 questions that we asked. Some of them were more about coping, some were about privilege, and some other things, but for this particular data set, it was, what kinds of positive feelings do you have? And at what different times have you felt these positive feelings? So for confidence, John, who he identifies as female to male, these are his terms, so we only use their terms that they used when they wrote them down. He said, making the steps toward doing this in the first place takes a lot of courage, and in the beginning it was like, is this really what I need to do? Can I do this really? And finally I thought, hey, I'm 49 years old and I can make these decisions for myself, and I know I'm male. And so I have to take these steps to do what I need to do. So part of this, courage was one of our categories that was underneath confidence. And then Chrissy, who is an M to F person, said, I looked at myself in the mirror like I believe every woman does before they walk out of the house, just to make sure. And I just looked and said, I'm looking good today. Walked out the door, hopped in the car, and it doesn't faze me to walk across the street, wait for the street light to change, sit out front on the park bench, and wait. And so what's interesting about this is that one of the findings we did find was that the trans women did talk about their looks a little bit more than the trans men did, and talked about looks in relation to emotions. And so when we're talking about socialization and stereotypes, it was kind of interesting to us about how socialization about being female and what that means for your looks, how that interrelates with emotions. And so then we also, I'm just giving you a sampling of some of the things that people talked about. So Chris, who's an FDM trans Latina person, said, a lot of my pride comes from being accepted by the fellow soldiers in my unit when I was deployed. A few of them actually knew I was trans and had no problem referring to me as Chris, and goofing off just as any other guys would. So that's been my best experiences. So Chris talks about this emotion of pride that he has, but it's based on how other people were treating him, specifically in the military, where if we're talking about work-related stuff, it's illegal to be trans in the military right now. So if you consider exactly what that means, that you can be dishonorably discharged for your identity where you are, but people are treating you well, and you have pride from that, that's a really interesting process. So John says, in terms of interpersonal emotions, so my stepmom, she's just so cool, and the other day she said, John, you're a really good man. And man, that's just, I was flying high all night, right? So this validation around being a good man and what that means for John. And then finally, Jacqueline says, I've actually been in one place trying on something when somebody made a comment. The girl told her, she said, she's no different than you are. Why do you have a problem with her trying on clothes if you want to go try on clothes? And that's, that right there, that makes me feel good. So what's interesting in this example is that Jacqueline was experiencing some discrimination when she went in to go try on some clothes, but it felt really good to her that someone was sticking up for her in that moment. So there's almost a mix of emotions that Jacqueline is describing here. So what was interesting is those were just a smattering of positive emotions and things that some of the trans people were describing. But then we thought, okay, so we have this sample of 13 genderqueer individuals. They don't identify as male or female. And we have no idea exactly what they're going to talk about in terms of their positive emotions either. So what we did is we did a very similar process. And if you have questions about how we analyzed the data and the methodology, I'm happy to talk about it. But we went through a very similar process as we did with the trans men and trans women. But then we found that there was really no way to categorize how some of the genderqueer people were talking about their emotions. So what we did is we actually found some emotion theories. We looked at some emotion theories, and we tried to plug in how genderqueer people were using emotion terms with existing emotion theories. So Parrott is a person who has a current emotion theory. And what we found was, there are 6 different types of primary emotions that Parrott talks about. 3 of them are more positive emotions. And so when genderqueer people were talking about their emotions, especially in terms of being validated with their identity, there were lots of different things included in here, right? So external validation from other people, family, relationships, therapists, and in the workplace. And even though our study was on positive emotions, not surprisingly, people have a hard time talking about positive emotions and not talking about the negative ones too. So in this particular study with genderqueer individuals, we were comparing, how much are they actually talking about experiencing positivity and negativity. So we can talk a little bit more about exactly what this means, but what I primarily wanted you all to see was how some of the folks were talking about these themes. So Jessie, who is a white genderqueer person, you notice this person in terms of external validation, this person says, one of the best things would be when people called me by my chosen name, so by Jessie. It's just one of the best things, just because I know who I am and everything, and I feel just when someone called me by my chosen name, it's like them accepting that. And for self-actualization, Andi says, and now it's just kind of a whole identity. I just feel pretty good about it. And I've started using the word genderqueer and using alternative pronouns, and in every interaction, it's just really kind of this final step, and I feel like I'm embracing it and coming out completely, and that's been really freeing to me. So there's a lot of positive emotions that are described in here. And what you'll notice is that for self-actualization, when we were talking about this, it's not love and it's not surprise, but it's mostly joy and how people talk about coming into who they are. And for identity, you'll also see here, right, 167 coded responses in terms of joy, and also 60 for sadness. But CJ says, when I wake up in the morning, I get to put the clothes on and everything that I want, and that just makes me feel as though I'm presenting myself the way I want to. When I look in the mirror, I see what I want to see, and it just makes me smile, and it makes me happy. For communication, CJ also says, it gives you a positive glow every morning to know that I have the words to talk about who I am, and this is okay. This is me, I don't have to feel bad about it, and that's great. And then I think this might be the final one, which is community. And again, we have love and joy and surprise here for positive emotions. And it's a lot easier to be prideful and content and stable when you've got this big community that you're a part of. And lastly, for expression, May says, I always felt like I was impinging on a woman's world, borrowing their clothes. And when I realized it's just an authentic female identity, I said, oh gosh, I deserve these clothes too. So I'm allowed to access that. I'm not stealing anybody's makeup, I'm allowed to have the same access as anybody. So there's just been an evolution of acceptance. And for May, and I'll say this specifically, so May was the only bigender person who was in our sample. And for her, some days she'd identify as female, and some days she'd identify as male. And so it just depended on how she was feeling from day to day. So when she was talking about this particular expression, she was talking about, having some of that acceptance specifically in a woman's world and what that meant for her expression. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a smattering of how people talk about positive emotions and some of the terminology that they use, and maybe more of the themes of what would come up like when somebody is talking about positive emotions in any type of therapeutic context. So for this particular presentation, I thought, well, it might be important for us to talk about some of the vocational impact. We have 2 amazing vocational researchers right here who I was trained by. And I thought, well, a lot of the people, even though we focus primarily on positive emotions and on privilege and some of these other things, we didn't specifically ask about employment within any of the 43 interviews. As you would expect, it came up a lot, right? Because work and career are an important piece of people's lives. And especially if you experience a lot of discrimination, a lot of times that discrimination happens in the workforce, and if that impacts your income, that impacts every other aspect of your life. We know a lot of this. So most of the studies that have looked at vocational impact of trans individuals primarily focus on negative experiences and discrimination. So I'm citing us on here, right? So Kim and I did a study a few years ago where we were talking about how trans people made decisions related to their careers and some of the barriers that were related to the process, which I think, I feel like it's an important study and says a lot of important things, and the focus on good stuff that happens in the workplace just wasn't a part of that study at all. And also, a lot of the studies now are focusing on the high rates of underemployment, especially trans people in general are pretty highly educated and highly underemployed. And so thinking about that, those disparities, transition at work lead to anxiety and depression, lots of interpersonal and policy-based discrimination. I'm working on a study right now with a colleague, Dr. Walensky, where we were looking at people who are genderqueer and how do genderqueer people compare to people who are trans men and women in the workplace. And it turns out that genderqueer people delay their transition process at work because they experience more policy-based discrimination, right? So, we're finding that there's all this stuff that's happening for vocational impact for trans people, but it's all negative. I have yet to have seen a study that has come out that talks about trans people's positive experiences or what was facilitative at work, what actually helped them in their process when they were transitioning. So what's interesting is that for all of those emotions and things like that that I was just talking about a minute ago, I thought, well, our whole study, we asked people for 2 hours to talk about their positive experiences and resiliency. So for this particular presentation, what I thought I would do is look through the transcripts and see how people talked about work. So this is the first time I'm actually talking about the work experiences that a lot of the participants talked about. So there's not a really specific methodology. I just thought I would share some of their stories with you and what they talked about. The other thing that I really thought would be important is so this happens in a lot of marginalized populations, but specifically in the LGBT community, we tend to focus on white LGBTQ folks. So I took the whole sample of the 10 folks of color and analyzed their positive experiences to see how they talk about their own intersecting identities at work and exactly what that means for all of their identities and how that comes into play. So I've been wondering, what happens if we actually have a better narrative about thinking about employment in positive ways? And how do we actually think about resilience for people who have multiple minority statuses? So these are some of my questions, and maybe we can have a conversation about that when I'm done talking about this. So here are the identities of the people who I'm going to be talking about today. So these are all pseudonyms. Through the whole presentation, I've been using pseudonyms. And what you'll notice is there's a wide range of different ages that we have here. I think the youngest person was 21, and the oldest person in the sample was 62. And they have a wide range of racial and ethnic identities, wide range of trans identities. And the interesting thing here, and we find this a lot, like I said, you'll see some disparities between how people's incomes and their education levels. If you look through some of this. So Kelly, for example, had talked about how she had been working for a really long time, had a bachelor's degree, and she listed her income as $0 to $10,000 a year. That was her household income, right? So there are some disparities in how people are educated and exactly what their incomes are in some of these instances. And the same thing with Rosalinda too, which I'll talk a little bit more about her experiences as we go through. Okay. So this is a kind of a cursory examination of what people talked about. But here were some positive outcomes that trans people of color talked about for their transitions at work. So for interpersonal, Rachel, she says, my work relationships are a lot better now because I'm who I'm supposed to be, not who I was. So I'm not the pushy, arrogant person I used to be. So that has shifted focus from being the egomaniac, basically, just to being a nice person and doing your job and succeeding in life. So for her, and there was an interpersonal outcome that people at work actually enjoyed working with her more once she transitioned. So we also have social support. This is the same person. So she says, and then the positives were, I really found out who my true friends were, which was really kind of tugged at the heartstrings because the people I thought were just coworkers ended up being true friends, right? So she not only found that, people liked her more when she was working, but that she also ended up with more social support after she transitioned, and this was specifically at work. And then in terms of confidence, Netu says, my pronouns are used correctly where I work. So just to give you some context, Netu identifies as gender nonconforming masculine and trans and uses they, them, and their pronouns instead of he, him, his, or she, her, hers. So their pronouns are used correctly where they work. Like, it's really been the greatest part about being here. That's sort of solidified. Before I was here, before I had a good experience of being out as trans, I was just really scared of it. So I didn't out myself, I didn't talk about it, and if I did, it was 1 or 2 people or whatever. Here at work, I can talk about it. So for Netu, the confidence of being actually to be who they are at work has really been a positive experience for them. Rachel says work confidence too. So work confidence, confidence in yourself to achieve just about anything you want, because this is one of the largest things a person could ever do in their life. I mean, we're just women, we want to live and be left alone like everyone else in the world, you know, succeed and live. So every day that I can walk down the street, walk into work with my head held high, I take a lot of confidence in that. Janae also talks about confidence at work, and this is a little bit of a different experience that she says. So she says, I'm not real social, and while I like Rose, who I worked with for years, and we were both undercover, which means they weren't out at work, it was the first time the 2 of us girls went to the mall, and I just have never had a feeling like that. And of course, Rose is very outgoing, and I'm really not outgoing, so she knew the ladies at Bare Essentials and Our House Furniture, which I put in the woodwork for one of my last jobs. And she was talking to them, and I just felt really good that day. And she said afterwards that I was positively glowing. So Janae works in construction and was doing a lot of woodwork for different kinds of organizations. So in this instance, it's not maybe necessarily focused on being at the workplace, but for her, she was with a coworker, right, who was also out, and then she was talking to people who she had contracted with, and she felt like she could be who she was. So the other piece of a positive outcome that people talked about was using their skill sets. So Netu said, I never thought I would get to answer people's questions. So I do these Trans 101 trainings for different student groups around the state, and I've done it for classes here at the university. I didn't ever think I would be the person answering questions because I've had so many. And getting to answer the questions was kind of an unexpected surprise. And it's pleasant because, yeah, I'm a nerd. I like learning and I like helping people learn. So that's something that I get to do that I didn't, it just never occurred to me that I would get to do that 5 or 6 years ago. So Netu talks about the fact that they get to use the skill set that they've kind of always had, but they get to actually use what they think is important to them personally at work. And then Dante, who's a Latina FTEM trans person, says, it's helped me a little bit with my job because I'm very efficient with my work as a mechanic in the military. And I know my job as a soldier, but it also helps me not be the stereotypical female that the military thinks, or is all girly girl, and they don't want me to get their nails dirty. And so I was just there working underneath an engine, so it helped in that aspect. So Dante was talking about how, you know, this efficiency at work, you know, I'm really good at my job, and so that was something that was fine because it actually helped me with my skill set. And we can talk a little bit more about Dante's experience in a minute. So one of the other positive outcomes that people experienced, and Dante said that it was being connected to a community. So I've also had some experiences when I was in the National Guard where looking more like who I am worked in my favor. I went to a company, it was an oil change place, and half the staff there was queer. I was coming home from boot, and all I needed was a job, and so I got a position there as an oil tech, mechanic, technician. I was able to gain a good experience and just be myself there. So actually being connected to the community was what helped Dante get a job that he actually liked. And then Haggai, who's from Israel and is an FDM transsexual, said, well, I did get a job once because of my gender. That was when I was in Israel. I was working as an instructor of an LGBT center where the teenagers were out of their home because they're either gay or lesbian or trans. And I was chosen to do this job because they needed a trans instructor. So I was, and I know the term in Hebrew, I just don't know what it's called in English. It's just the opposite of discrimination, right? So Haggai was talking about how he actually felt like there were things that he got benefits from when he was living in Israel. Now, he had the opposite experience in the States, and that was something that he was talking about as being a comparison of living in his home country versus living in the US. Okay, so some of the folks who talked about work also reframed their transition. So the interviewer asked Janae, how long have you used the term male to female? And she said, well, just for 3 years. I was lucky enough when I got 30 years, and at the age of 48, I could retire from the carpenters union. My wife, my spouse, she worked at the time, and that's when I started looking online and finding out that there's a lot of other people. So what I'll say here, and this is if you want to do any type of positive work or any type of work with trans people, which is that Janae reframed this idea of being lucky at work because she waited to transition until she could retire because she felt like she couldn't actually transition in the carpenters union. So what may feel like to her she had to suppress pieces of herself, she also feels like she can reframe it to say, I got to retire early, and so then I got to actually be who I was. And then Rosalinda reframes her transition. So she said, I did very good work. My work was highly trained, and in our screen printing world, it's a small world. There's people who would call me and say, you know, I don't care that you're trans. That's what they were talking about. You're my friend, and I'm going to stick with you no matter what they're saying about you. They're afraid that their clients might walk into my shop and see, oh my God, especially when I started hiring other trans people. Some of my workers got really bent out of shape about it. It created problems. Even inside the LGBT community, I was an outcast. Lesbians didn't want me in their bars. Queer men didn't want me around. I had established my own little world. I started getting a very positive feeling about me when I started thinking, no, this is who I am, and this is what God created me to be. That's where I started from. I started to form a closer relationship with God. That's how I come to talk about peace, love, and joy. And this has been a process. It didn't just happen. And I keep spreading the word because that's my new mantra, right? So Rosalinda, she talks about experiencing some disparities and a lack of connection in some of the things that we talked about. But for her, her resilience is focused on being really confident in who she is and really thinking about spreading concepts of peace, love, and joy. So that's how she reframes her work transition. So then there were folks who talked about the intersection of race and work. And I think I'll be curious to hear some responses to how people think about how this was talked about in the interviews. So Rachel says, I have a friend at work who's African American. When I met him after I came back in the May of last year, he looked at me and said, you're the new black, meaning bigotry and stuff of the world. The African Americans and stuff still have an issue, but we're, meaning trans people, kind of like the new focus now for all the weirdos of the world, wanting to, the negatives are there and they're huge, but the positives are just so awesome, right? So Rachel identifies as a person of color. She's Native American and white. And what's interesting is so she's talking about a lot of different stuff in here related to a lot of negativity. And then she says, but the positives are just so awesome. So it's kind of, there's a lot happening in this quote that I'd be really interested to unpack with people in the audience. And then Janae says, well, my Native American spirituality. One of my elders told me once, when you follow this path, you'll find out things about yourself and they'll be hard to understand, but you'll find your true self. And that helped me. And there we have in Inupi, people call it a sweat lodge, but it's a sacred ceremony, and once a month we have it, and they all accept me. And I have this part-time job cleaning, I have a contract to clean, so I dress androgynous there, and I don't really want to I don't try to watch how I sit or how I hold a glass or anything. I just try to be me. So Janae is connecting her Native American spirituality and finding her true self with her ability to just feel like she can be like herself at work. And then Hyun Ki talked a little bit about his experiences of being a Korean adoptee, and I'll give you a little bit of context to this. So he said, race and ethnicity, unfortunately, is something you can't change. You can't wake up one day and be like, hello, I'm white. Although, if you could, that would be amazing. So we can talk about some internalized racism right there. Switch a little thing in the mirror, oh yes, today I'm black. I think it could play into your transition if you had a traditional family. For instance, my parents are white and I've been adopted. So playing into that part of ethnicity, it's not as strong. Where I can see someone who is of the Asian culture who has Asian traditional parents, first generation, that could be really hard. Asian parents have all of these expectations. You're gonna be this person and have this job and go to this school and achieve this grade, right? So when he was talking about this, he was saying, I actually feel better that I am adopted and have white parents because they don't tell me I have to have this Asian type of job. And it was easier for me in my transition to think about that. So the last thing that I have on here is this last piece of advice that Netu has. So they say, and this is related to the It Gets Better project. So Netu said, I think a lot of people say that it gets better. And I think that's true for some, but I'd rather say you can make it better. You can be okay whether or not anybody else is. You can get to an okay place, whether that's with therapy, whether that's with a community, whether that's just finding an affirming workspace. You can make it better. It's just, do you want to make it better? And those are conversations I have all the time. What do you want to do? And I think no one ever tells that to anyone. They say, oh, you'll move, you'll grow up, it won't be so hard. No, it's still hard. It's just, you have to decide how to invest your energy. And I invested it in me, and by proxy, I invested it back. Investing it back into the community, because that's why I do my work. But without investing energy in me, nothing else would get better. So the It Gets Better campaign doesn't speak to me. But there's another one that we can make it better. And I think that's a message I would rather tell people than it'll be better. Which I thought was a really amazing way to sum up the, telling people, oh, it'll be fine, you'll just get over this, you'll be resilient. It's more, how can you use all of these resources and come together as a community and work on yourself to be able to help other people. Okay, so what does this mean for future directions? So as I mentioned before, and I know some people have to leave it too, so please, if you need to get up, it's completely fine. So research paints trans people as being pathological. We talked about that, right? So we know that some of this idea that it's all negative and it's all bad leads to discriminatory policies and interactions at work. And then it can also mean that it leads to an inattention to training programs. So most of you are in training programs, right, where you're learning how to either be therapists, surgeon work, in human development. I'll wait just a second.
It's an exodus.
Yes, a mass exodus.
Thank you.
Schedule them back.
I know.
We don't give them any time.
Yeah, well, so what I wanted to say here is that, I know I've been kind of going rapid fire about positivity today, but the primary thing here is that if we think of trans people as being pathological, the only time we typically pay attention to pathology in our training programs is, okay, we're gonna have a day on gender dysphoria when we are talking about it in the diagnosis class, right? Or we're really focusing on this deviance or pathology in training programs. We're not talking about all these amazing things that trans people are saying about their positive experiences, their emotions, and some of the things that have helped them be resilient at work. So, there's these concepts of it's not helping us at all learn how to be better professionals. This other piece that I have that I think would be great if we are going to have a discussion about this is I have yet to figure out how to give a presentation about positivity without also validating the fact that it is really hard and that there is a lot of discrimination and that there is a lot of difficulty. And so I don't really know what this looks like. I don't know how to talk to you all about all these positive emotions and positive experiences at work without also saying it is really hard. And what does that mean for interventions? What does that mean for how we talk to clients? So these are a lot of the questions that I'm still coming up with. So we can change this dominant narrative. So part of it is, it's not all negative, but sometimes it is, right? So how do we start talking about it in terms of the entire experience, the whole experience? And I don't know any of this yet. I'm gonna put all this out here for us to start talking about. So, that's where we begin. Yeah.
Thanks, that was great. So, you ended with this idea that positivity and negativity go hand in hand. And I wonder if it's part of the reason why you found this dual kind of relationship was your sample.
Mm-hmm.
By focusing on individuals that have already transitioned, they're already at this stage of identity development, right? Where they've really thought through it. And they're acknowledging that this is a commitment, but they're also recognizing that this comes with costs and benefits, right?
Sure. I mean, well, but that depends. We actually did look at where they were in their identity process. We had them rate on the line of where you think you are, even though identity isn't linear. We all know that. So we had them rate on the line, where do you think you are? And, out of all 43, it was really a range of where people were. So I think some of it just depends on, I think you're right in terms of people being able to maybe even look back and have some hindsight about their transition process. And for the people who are more in the beginning parts, for example, Dante, he's the F10 Latina identified person, he wasn't out in the military, right? So
Right.
he hadn't really transitioned the way that he wanted to yet. And so for him too, he's also experiencing a lot of this stuff all in the moment, all at once. So we had a wide range of developmental processes that people talked about.
And have you looked at the data, if you group it by where you think these people were on their developmental processes?
Yep, we haven't looked at that yet. There's so much. I mean, honestly, these interviews, there's probably 100 pages of text for each person, and there are 43 people. And so I know, I think you can just see, like, oh my gosh, there's just so much data. And so no, we haven't looked at that yet. But we did ask about developmental processes, and we do have the information. We just don't know what that looks like yet. Yeah.
So I'm interested in, so I know that certain careers are thought of traditionally as being more male or more female. I was wondering if you looked yet at or saw a pattern of that people were choosing careers based on the identity they were going to be transitioning to or based on the one they started with, and if being in kind of a gender traditional workplace, how that either eased or kind of if it made it more difficult to transition.
Yeah, so that was something that we looked at in the previous study. So the one that was published in 2010 was actually, it was more gender stereotypical for the trans women, right? So I have this very distinct memory of sitting with this woman and asking her about her career experiences. This is just one example. And she said, well, you know, I'm trying to figure out what I want to do now because now that I'm a woman, I feel like I now need to be a secretary or a teacher, you know, and so she did have she was a little bit older. So she had very stereotypical ideas of what she wanted to do, but she also was currently unemployed. And so I think that for her, she didn't have the luxury of being able to have some time to think about what she wanted to do. But what we did find was it seemed to be more stereotyped for trans women than anybody else. And part of that is I do think if we think about gender socialization, women really do feel more constricted and talk about feeling more constricted in some of their job options just because of policies and history and all sorts of stuff. So that didn't come out in this study, but we also didn't ask specifically about work or career. So I'd be curious how that would come out, especially with genderqueer people who don't identify as male or female. How would that look in terms of how you choose a career? Does gender even come in to it at all?
And not only how they choose a career, but I was wondering, for example, like you mentioned the one who I think, Janae, who was working in a carpenter's union, talked about transitioning after. Like, would that have been too hard to make a male to female transition when you're in a male stereotypical role?
Yep.
Like, would they face more? Would you think they would face more discrimination or
Yes.
fear more discrimination?
That was one of the findings that we found in the previous study. So there was a woman who worked in a factory for a large car company, and she had worked there for 30 years as this like dude, right? She talked about having a big beard, wearing a motorcycle jacket to work. This was when she identified as male, and then when she transitioned, she was in the union, and she was the union president as both male and female. So she actually had a really positive experience with her transition because it was a big company. But I think when it's smaller companies, especially more masculine roles, a lot of the folks did talk about some fears around what that looked like. And one of our participants was sexually assaulted at work. She was in the construction industry. So, I mean, you know, some of that you can kind of piece together about what that might mean, but we don't know a lot about it yet. Yeah.
Thank you for this. I think this was great. But I did have a question, because just even anecdotally, I have friends who identify as genderqueer, gender nonconforming, and I know for them personally, a lot of like positive emotions will come more so from those individual interpersonal connections.
Yep.
And it seemed like in a lot of the quotes, that's where those positive emotions came from. So less about the overall environment, policy, procedure, and more like my one coworker acknowledged. Aside from the one individual that works at a university setting,
Right.
which is, generally speaking, university settings are more accepting and progressive. So
Yeah.
I was wondering, especially since there is so much more data that you weren't able to capture in this, did you notice that the vast majority of positive emotion came from those interpersonal relationships as opposed to any larger construct?
So the way that people tended to talk about emotions, and it didn't seem like there was a difference based on trans identity across the board, was, you know, people talked about these internal experiences that they had. I'm confident in me, I feel like, and some of that was because as people responded to them in a more positive way, they ended up having more confidence. But for some people, it was just this very internal process of, I had to accept the fact that I could identify as someone who wasn't male or female. I had to come to that cognitive conclusion, and then that acceptance then led to me coming out and then people responding to me in a positive way, right? So there has to be this interesting balance of this internal and external process that happens. What's interesting for genderqueer people, I'd mentioned that study that's under review right now that I'm doing with my friend Dan, and this sample has 6,500 trans people in it, right? So there were 1,000 genderqueer people in the sample that we looked at, and then I'm not sure exactly, the sample of trans men and women was a little bit higher than that. And so we were looking at policy discrimination and interpersonal discrimination at work. Interpersonal discrimination didn't come up at all for anybody. It didn't come up as significant in any of the quantitative analyses, and so, but I know anecdotally that it's an experience that people talk about, and so the data just aren't capturing what I talk about with my clients in therapy or what my friends talk about. You know, so there's something going on with the data and also maybe how we're asking the questions. So, you know.
Was that an existing data set, or
Yes.
did you?
No, I didn't collect the 6,500 responses. It's from the National Transgender Discrimination Survey, and it comes out of the DC. It's a big trans group that collected the data. It was survey research, so most of the responses were yes, no, and so when we look at dichotomous variables, sometimes it's hard to figure out a little bit more about the nuances of what's going on, but it was interesting that the interpersonal discrimination just didn't seem to be contributing to workplace satisfaction. It didn't contribute to delaying a transition. It wasn't really coming out as being significant, but policy discrimination was. Am I protected at work? You know, like what's happening with a lot of that specific stuff, and more so for genderqueer people. So, I don't know. Yeah.
Did you guys find anything, like, I know you talked a lot about like their transgender identity, but how did that like relate with their vocational identity, and like how did the developmental trajectories of both, like, did they influence each other?
Mm-hmm. Well, so for the positive experiences study, because we didn't ask specifically about vocational identity, that didn't really come out. It was more, I mean, to me it's interesting that we didn't ask about vocational stuff at all, and yet it was a huge piece of what people were talking about, right? So we're clearly missing asking a lot of important questions about career. When we asked about those specific things for people in the sample a few years ago, you know, part of it, I will say the sample is in Wisconsin, right? And so I think some of the people who were talking about their vocational identity, it was more related to some of the gender stuff, like what do I think I can do now? How am I going to be treated at work? So it was too hard to tease apart the vocational identity and the trans identity because those things seemed to be so intertwined with what can I do? Will I be hired? Will I get fired? You know, and the fact that I think there are only 12 states out of the 50 that even have protections for trans people, right? So most states, Massachusetts is one state that does have protections, but the last 2 states where I've worked, the last 3 states I've worked didn't have statewide protection for trans people, right? So you can actively discriminate a trans person at work, and at least for those states, you know, it's not something that you can necessarily get in trouble for. Other than if you then go, the ACLU picks up your case and then you do something more national, right? But so I think it's too hard to tease all of that apart right now.
So I wonder if you find anything about the decision-making process about the transgender people in relation to how they perceived the environment and how they direct their own thoughts, like get rid of some negative thoughts and get more positive thoughts, or how they perceive other thoughts about themselves.
Yeah, so in the decision-making study, people made decisions to come out at work based on their thoughts how much discrimination or how much support they felt like they were going to have. So people are always appraising, you know, how do I think this is going to happen? I already know my boss pretty well, or I already know my clients pretty well and how I'm working around them. So I can make what I think is an informed decision about how I think other people are going to respond, and that's going to help my decision if I'm going to come out at work or what kinds of jobs